I'm here to talk about post-acute COVID-19. Right now, a lot of the focus is still on acute COVID-19, and with the deployment of vaccines, it certainly feels like we're starting to get a better grasp over this virus and the pandemic. But unfortunately, what's becoming more in the limelight is the idea of persistent symptoms in people who did get a COVID-19 infection. It is called post-acute. Some people also call it long COVID. Like so many things that haven't yet solidified within the scientific community, there's no agreement yet on symptoms, definitions, even what to call it. I decided to kind of go through the literature, as little as there is, because this is very much a developing situation, and see what we can figure out about post-acute COVID-19. So to begin with, let's talk very briefly about acute COVID-19. Most of this is probably known to you already. It is caused by the novel coronavirus that was originally brought to the WHO's attention on December 31st, 2019. It is still a major problem here in the globe, with cases, as you can see from today, are astronomical, with major impacts on government, economy, society, all across the world. Luckily, we do have 2 authorized vaccines available to the public, but as you can see, and actually you can check out this website, it's pretty cool. There's a tracker of kind of vaccinations here in the United States. Only 6.5% of the US population has one of those, and only 1.3 have both doses. So right now, coronavirus is still a threat to many people, especially those perhaps in poor health. Now, the NIH has kind of classified COVID in this clinical spectrum. I'm not going to go through all of this, but they do have these 5 classifications. Even people who are asymptomatic, they don't have a positive virological test. Oh, they do have a positive virological test, but they may not have any of the symptoms, to things of the mild cases, mild and moderate, taking up the majority of the cases that patients will get. But the severe illness and critical illness can cause great concern. It usually causes hospitalization, time in the ICU, if not outright, unfortunately, death. And there are many risk factors for COVID-19, that everything from your age to pre-existing conditions, unfortunately even being pregnant, or lifestyle choices can make you more at risk for COVID-19. Diagnosis is done through a viral test, either kind of a molecular antigen as well as an antibody test. Over here, this graph on the right, I kind of did want to point out though, since there is still sometimes confusion about if the PCR test can actually detect. And so this study did kind of look at after weeks of onset of symptoms, like the number of PCR tests, and determined if they were positive, negative. So you can see that about once you start hitting the 5-6 week mark, your positive rate does plummet a lot. So people do say that past 6 weeks, you're definitely not going to be able to detect the virus anymore. So yeah, and so positivity is about 24 days and 24.5 days if you're asymptomatic. So long COVID-19, again, also called post-acute COVID-19, definitions. I was able to find 2 definitions. This one by the author Amenta. She proposed that you have persistent symptomology behind 12 weeks after your initial symptoms, and that the virus has not been recovered after 10 days following the mild symptom onset or 20 days after severe or critical. And then for those people who have remained hospitalized at 3 weeks after symptom onset, they consider that post-acute period when you do get discharged from that acute care. The CDC also has their own definition. It's a little bit more simple. They're just saying it's persistent symptoms 4 weeks after that initial infection and continue unknown for unknown duration. So you can see kind of here in this graph, you can see kind of the general onset since symptoms, and then prolonging past that 4-week phase where you get the acute within the first 2 weeks. Then you do get this post-acute like hyperinflammatory illness, which in this presentation I didn't focus too much on, but can cause severe issues a few weeks after your onset. But the past 4 weeks, you start getting into this vague territory, as you can even tell from the graph, where you have these pathophysiological pathways that are kind of proposed, but nothing's been proven yet. And you start getting these very vague symptoms that are cardiovascular or neurological in nature. And even, laboratory tests are pretty much uncharacterized by this point. So what I ended up doing is I did a literature review. I found about 9 papers that address these persistent symptoms. I'm not going to go through all 9 of them right here in details. I do have notes on them. So if anybody is interested, I'd be happy to share it with you or share to you this particular link on these papers. But I wanted to just go over some general kind of overview of these papers. All of them would kind of look at a study period after infection or being discharged from the hospital. And it could range from 12 days to 210 days. So some of them looked very immediately after your infection, and others did wait for a couple of months. And right away, you can start seeing some differences in what these papers are reporting. The amount of patients with persistent symptoms ranged everywhere from about 13% of them had persistent symptoms to 87% of their study population ended up with these persistent symptoms. It's not completely clear why we're seeing such differences in these rates. My guess is one of them has to do with whether their study population was more on like the mild or moderate scale, or if these were individuals that ended up like admitted into the hospital. And as you'll see in a bit, that does seem to affect whether you do get persistent symptoms or not. So these studies did very much vary on whether they were more focused on mild or more severe cases of COVID. Again, there is no formal definition of this long COVID-19. So people created, not necessarily created, but they had their own criteria for what they thought a symptom would be, and those vary wildly. So it's possible that they didn't ask the right symptoms, and that may have led to either a decreased amount of people saying they had persistent symptoms, or perhaps an overinflated amount. And then some of these papers actually did take patients who were not tested, like officially tested positive for COVID-19. They would argue that since COVID tests, particularly in the beginning of the pandemic, were so difficult to get a hold of, that they would be excluding a large amount of the population. And there are even areas in the country, more rural areas, where it's very difficult to get a test. And so these tend to be more in the survey or online surveys that tended to allow people to still answer whether their serological test was positive or negative. But do keep that in mind, because of course you might get a little bit more of an inflation of symptoms if people are not actually diagnosed with COVID. So all these papers ended up listing what they found to be the most common persistent symptom. I went through and you can see that out of all of them, fatigue, so 8 out of the 9 papers I found said that fatigue was a very common symptom. Dyspnea is another one, so kind of that shortness of breath. And then with 6 out of 9 papers having that. And then the rest of these were reported as their most common in about 2 or 3 papers. So you have everything from chest pain, cough, the loss of smell and taste, memory loss, sleep disorder, and then psychological distress. There are many, many more symptoms than this that are considered possible criteria for long COVID-19. These are just the most common that these researchers happen to find. So here's some general trends that were identified by doing these studies. Age does seem linked with your likelihood of developing persistent symptoms. In one study, they did find that that if you're over 50 years of age, like almost half of them reported to not having returned to normal. And another paper did find that one of your highest risk of not returning to normal health was being 50 years of age or older. And then persistent symptoms, this D60 means that they looked at like day 60 from onset of symptoms. So if you were age 40 to 60, you were more likely to have persistent symptoms even 60 days out from your first infection. So another trend is that luckily in time, it does seem that, my mistake for the typo here, but the number of persistent symptoms does decrease with time. One study found that in total, they had the 13.3% of their study population had symptoms lasting more than 28 days. And then 4.5% of that 13.3 had symptoms that lasted more than 56 days. And then only 2.3% of that population had symptoms lasting longer than 94 days. And then another study did find that like at day 30, there's 68% that present with one symptom, but by day 60, it did drop a small amount. Another trend that I did talk about very briefly is that your illness severity does seem to increase your chance of developing these persistent symptoms. Some studies did include the fact whether they were in the hospital or if they were into ICU. So for the first figure, you can see that anybody in the ICU did have a much higher percentage of fatigue and dyspnea and psychological distress than those who were not ever admitted into the ICU. However, at least one paper did find no significant difference between ICU and non-ICU patients. So again, at this point, we're still seeing a lot of variety in our results, which definitely indicates that it needs to be studied more. And then this is one of the graphs I was just telling you about, where you can see that the ICU patients, on average, just do have more persistence of symptoms than any of the patients. In this case, ward just means that, you know, they were in the hospital and got to go home. So we talked about some of these very common symptoms like the fatigue and cough, but there are some more rare ones that are quite serious. Cardiovascular lingering issues. You've seen inflammation and myocarditis are found after COVID-19 infection. So once they looked at 100 German patients, and a vast majority of them had some sort of like COVID-19 cardiac involvement, and 70% of them did have this inflammation. And we're looking at, so you can see that it's about 71 days later. And then they even looked at college athletes who we do think to be in prime health, and they still even had evidence of myocarditis anywhere from 12 to 53 days later, depending on when they had interviewed the athletes. There are pulmonary issues as well. Even 3 months after discharge, you know, 64% of these patients did have some sort of radiological abnormality or pulmonary dysfunction. Another group of patients, 30 days after discharge, had decreased diffusion capacity for carbon monoxide and diminished respiratory muscle strength. And then finally, neurological, they are seeing that even 3 months out, there are people who can have something as serious as seizures to something that's not a serious brain fog, but is very debilitating to people who are trying to go back to work and get on with their lives. So there are two papers in particular that I think did a more interesting analysis that I would like to go into more detail about. This one is the attributes and predictions of long COVID, looking at the COVID symptom study app. So they had a subset of 4,182 users. All of these individuals did test positive by PCR or a swab. And they ended up comparing these acute COVID-19 symptoms against these long COVID-19 COVID-19 patients, and this is the one where they had like 28, patients that have had symptoms for longer than 28 days, longer than 56 days, and then possibly longer than 94 days. So one of the things that they did that no one else did is they did look at how intermittent some of the symptoms are. So I actually just recovered from COVID-19, and I was kind of happy they mentioned this because that was the weirdest part to me, is that I'd feel fine like one day, and then like a couple hours later I'd feel terrible, or like my sense of smell would come and go, and it felt like really strange to me. So they actually addressed that, and I have a graph on the next slide that we can look at it more closely. And they did find that that long COVID, for people who had symptoms past 28 days, some of these, like the cardiac symptoms, the concentration issues, and any of these more like peripheral neuropathy symptoms are way overrepresented for those with persistent symptoms than those who had like just the acute. So, so you can see here, over on the left, you can see the symptoms. The hollow, so the bar in general, including the hollow part, is the entire duration, that kind of the number of days people were reporting that they had symptoms, but then the solid part indicates the actual number of days during that period that they experienced the symptoms. So they may have had a period of 20 days where they were feeling delirium, but only 10 of those days did they actually experience the symptoms. So you can see that some of them, like fatigue, seems very ongoing throughout that entire period, while some of them, like unusual muscle pains, is very intermittent throughout this, throughout your kind of symptom phase. Something else that this author did is she did notice these two symptomology patterns with long COVID-19. So the first pattern is she found that there are patients that exclusively have fatigue, headache, and upper respiratory complaints. And that's pretty much it. And you can tell that's group 0, that they don't have nearly as much, that they're definitely more just the, I would have to go back to show you kind of what the, so yeah, FA would be fatigue. So they have only those, they're only really showing those symptoms, while group 1 has these multi-system complaints. They tend to have an ongoing fever, and even still some gastrointestinal issues. And so you can see in their group that they're almost lighting up the board here, and that they're still showing a very wide variety, but they noticed that the patients ended up being in one of the two. So either you just kind of had the upper respiratory, or you had these huge multi-system symptoms going on. Another paper I wanted to take a bit of a closer look at is characterizing long COVID in an international cohort. So they were able to find close to 4,000 respondents from 56 countries. Do note that only 27% of these respondents do have a laboratory confirmed diagnosis of COVID-19. So of course, keep that in mind when interpreting these results. They looked at 205 symptoms to see just what a COVID symptom was. And then they finally identified 66 of them and traced them over 7 months. What was interesting about them is they actually found 3 clusters of almost symptom trends, and I can show you the graphs on the next slide in a moment. But well, there it is. You can take a quick look at it, and then I'll go back. So the first cluster are symptoms that, these are some that appear very early, and they reach a peak about 2 to 3 weeks, and then they start decreasing over time. So these are very almost acute symptoms that just seem to fall away. Cluster 2 are symptoms that have a very slow decrease, slow increase, or just unchanging. It kind of just looks like a plateau. You get it, and then it just stays with you as you're trying to recover. And then the last one is that are symptoms that just actually increase over the first 2 months, and then they sort of plateau at the end. So, and sorry if it's a little small, if anybody's interested in the figure, I can send it to you. But here you can see they broke up the different categories, and then they slotted in the symptom based on their cluster. So the diarrhea, loss of appetite, sore throat, fever, that tends to be very acute symptoms of COVID-19, but you can see that there are many individuals who are still having, for example, the shortness of breath here in cluster 2. And then even in that third cluster, you can see things like the joint pain is actually beginning to increase as time goes on from like your initial infection. Yeah, less than 20% of these survivors said that they were just asymptomatic at their first like follow-up visit. Any patient they found that was in the ICU still showed symptoms at 3-month follow-up. And all of these patients were seeking out psychiatric evaluations more than any other doctor appointment. And the researchers seem to think that that could be, it's hard to tell, but one of the things is it could just be due to the stress of the disease. You're in quarantine. Unfortunately, during a pandemic, there are going to be funerals, there are going to be sickness in your family, which can clearly have a very heavy toll on a patient. Also, you can see that, I believe this is SARS again, that 40% of the respondents had active psychiatric illness, and this is 4.13 months after infection. Chronic fatigue problem, and that almost 30% of them actually met the criteria for chronic fatigue syndrome. Once again, going back to psychiatric, because maybe if you're like me, you're a bit surprised that this is a symptom for these infectious diseases. Some of the most common is post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, panic disorder, and whatnot. So these diseases don't take just a heavy toll on your body, they do take a heavy toll on your mind as well. And we'll talk about it in a bit later, but the chronic fatigue could also be caused by the cytokine storm, which is being explored for some of these illnesses. So especially ones that have these persistent symptoms. So West Nile is another one where you see, again, very similar symptoms to what we've been talking about: muscle weakness, memory loss, depression, difficulty concentrating, headache, and we're talking 8 years after infection, people are still having these symptoms. And there's many more that I did not have time to go into. Influenza, Ebola, and Zika all have reported post-infection persistent symptoms for some individuals. So what's going on? So I'll be honest with you, there is not too much yet in the way of these hypothesized diagnoses. Some researchers are mentioning it, but just throwing it out there as, hey, this could be a possibility, but nobody has actually looked into this into any detail. One of this is this MECFS syndrome, which has manifestations that are very similar to post-acute COVID-19, and it has been seen with other coronaviruses and viruses. So for people recovering from SARS for 4 years after infection, about almost 30% of them qualified for this diagnosis. Here we go, here's Ebola. It does share common symptomologies with this MECFS, again, fatigue, muscle, sleep problems. And here's influenza, where in Norway, they found an incidence rate of about 2 people per 100,000, sorry, not 2 people, 2 per 100,000 person months of this kind of MECFS. Unfortunately, there's not yet any known cause or diagnostic tool, but it is at least recognized by the medical and scientific community. Another one is mast cell activation syndrome. So COVID-19 does see the release of these pro-inflammatory cytokines, especially IL-6. Mast cells are kind of a key source for these cytokines, and there have been deceased patients with COVID-19 were found to have mast cells in their lung, which were linked to this inflammation and thromboses. And the persistent symptoms of that we've discussed, of being tired, having brain fog, and other symptoms are very similar to those patients that presented with mast cell activation syndrome. So there are individuals who think that this may be a worthwhile route to begin exploring for long COVID. So the idea of the direct tissue invasion by the virus, especially by this ACE2, which is a kind of a protection factor existing in a variety of organs. And they do play a role in regulating blood pressure, among other things. But ACE2 is a target for the coronaviruses and influenza viruses. So when the viruses bind to these ACE2 receptors, it can cause elevated blood pressure and increased cerebral hemorrhage. And then if it does interact, if the proteins interact in ACE2 in a specific way, it can damage the blood-brain barrier and enter the central nervous system by attacking the vascular system. So that could explain why we do see some of these neurological symptoms.
I think the ACE2, it's important to note that the ACE2 is the receptor for the virus. Yeah. So it's also not just the virus binds to it and activates it as a receptor. The virus binds to it, and this is how it enters the cells by forming a complex with the receptors, and the receptor gets internalized with the virus. And that's at least one way the virus enters the cells. So the more ACE2 you have in tissue, or the more affinity, like for example, those new variants, they can bind to ACE2 more tightly. So the more binding there is to those ACE2 receptors, the more the virus will be able to enter the cells and replicate.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. And here is the kind of the idea of the inflammation and cytokine storm, where a cytokine storm is just a failure of negative feedback mechanisms that leads to this hyperinflammation and overproduction of inflammatory cytokines and soluble mediators. And IL-6 is positively correlated with COVID-19 severity. That has been found already. So there are people who are suggesting that there is that examination, which and that cytokines have been implicated in this post-infectious that we talked about, ME, CFS, and COVID-19 as well. So that one's more popular. I actually have heard kind of about the cytokine storm before doing the research. So that one may be beginning to pick up some steam. And then there are other ones that I didn't have full time to research, but we have disorders of the autonomic nervous system, immune system damage, the idea that the virus could be just lingering in places that it's difficult for the immune system to eradicate. And even there are people thinking that this could mostly be just post-ICU syndrome, that being in the ICU is a very traumatic experience, not only for your body, but for mentally, and perhaps that is causing some of these persistent symptoms we see after you do get discharged from the hospital. So speaking of persistent symptoms, some of you in here are very aware that Lyme disease also can have persistent symptoms as post-treatment Lyme disease. For those of you who do not know, I'll just quickly go over what Lyme disease is. I'm not spending much time on this at all. It is acquired from a tick bite here in the United States. It's from Ixodes scapularis or Ixodes pacificus as the two hosts. There are three clinical stages. With the first early localized stage has the very classic bullseye's rash, not in every patient, but it is at least the most famous of the symptoms, with mild flu-like fever and fatigue. If you don't treat it, it begins to spread to other parts of your body and other organ systems. You can start getting Lyme carditis, Lyme neuroborealis, and other flu-like symptoms. And then about 6 months later, if you still haven't gone in for treatment, you start seeing Lyme arthritis and these neurological abnormalities. The diagnosis is through a 2-tier serological test, but sensitivity is low during that very first stage. So unfortunately, many people do not get the diagnosis they need, and that is why it remains untreated and can progress to these later stages. However, if you do catch it, treatment is a very simple antibiotic regimen that is, for most people, perfectly fine and cures them. However, For some individuals, they continue to have persistent symptoms. It's about 6 months. That's the classification. It's like 6 months after treatment with antibiotics, you still have persistent symptoms. And by this point, you probably recognize them. It's fatigue, it's bodily pain, cognitive difficulties, and the psychological distress. There is no clear diagnosis of post-treatment Lyme disease. We do not have a firm understanding at all about these persistent symptom diseases. There is some suggested mechanisms, but it's a bit of a, there are varying opinions on what is the correct mechanism for it. Some people believe it is this infection-induced immune dysfunction, and others think that the bacteria is still in the body and it's inflammation due to the persistent bacteria. And you'll see papers exploring both sides of it. From what I can tell, there still isn't a clear answer on what could possibly be the true mechanism. So now long COVID versus post-treatment Lyme disease. Are these similar at all? Can we start making any assumptions about this? So one of them, and I probably should do a little bit more research to flesh this out, is that kind of inflammation, where we are looking at these elevated levels of IL-6. Elevated levels of IL-6 have been found in neurological Lyme disease patients, and we have seen these pro-inflammatory cytokines in the cerebrospinal fluid of patients also with neurological Lyme disease. And since we know that there's an elevation of cytokines in COVID-19, perhaps it may be worthwhile to look at some of these inflammatory pathways in these long haulers to see if we can figure out kind of what's going on with them, similar to post-treatment Lyme disease. So the gut microbiome, that has gathered attention since the microbiome has been implicated in many diseases with symptoms that overlap those of post-treatment Lyme disease, because the gut microbiome can influence host metabolism, nervous systems, immune system. And one paper out in 2020, they were able to distinguish post-treatment Lyme disease patients from those that were just ICU patients or healthy, or just healthy samples. So there does seem to be something about the gut microbiome changing in some way after this infection. And what do you know? COVID-19 in the acute version can cause gastrointestinal distress, including nausea, diarrhea, and this form of like anorexia of not wanting to eat. And so that there has been a suggestion that the gut microbiome is involved in COVID-19 severity. And I didn't put it in here, but I have heard that again in one of my other research, that if you have those gastrointestinal issues, you're at higher risk of having a more severe version of COVID-19. And one paper has shown that your gut microbiome does not revert back and can remain with you even after you clear the virus. So now we have two kind of diseases with persistent symptoms where it can change your gut microbiome, and it can remain that way even after you are cleared of the infection. So perhaps looking at the gut microbiome, we can find some similarities between these sort of diseases. And then, as many of you know who have worked on this project, working with Johns Hopkins, we use machine learning and differential expression analysis and gene enrichment to look at the longitudinal gene expression to try to kind of identify Lyme disease patients through either clustering or molecular markers. To my understanding, the ultimate goal is to be able to really figure out post-treatment Lyme disease, and using these techniques to predict who's going to go on to get post-treatment Lyme disease. And since the symptomology is so similar for COVID-19, it may also prove beneficial to try and determine if we can look at these analyses and machine learning to try to determine who's going to develop these persistent symptoms. Perhaps there's a shared mechanism or something similar between them, that if you figure out one, you may be able to figure out the other. So if we are going to do future research, these are just some very broad things to consider. Critical versus non-critical patients, you know, do patients who had severe COVID or were in ICU, they may have a very different experience with their persistent symptoms than somebody who just had mild. So when creating your studies, you need to consider that fact, because they're probably going to have different trajectories. Comorbidities have been shown to be incredibly important. And so you, things like age and BMI can affect whether you're more likely to get persistent symptoms. So there needs to be a good understanding of your population and understand how that could affect, not just, you know, it could just be some more like conditional factors that also mean that they're going to go on to get persistent symptoms. And then right now, this is still a very new pandemic. It's just barely a year old. So these studies have really only looked like a few months out. We do not know how long it will be. We don't know if the symptoms are going to change. So I think this sort of research is now beginning to pick up, because it has been over a year. So this could be one of the first times for people to actually begin looking at this and maybe having enough data to start looking beyond just a few months post-infection. But yeah, if you have any additional questions for me, if you ever want to talk long COVID, I do have resources and some notes on it, and I'd be happy to speak to you about it.